Algis Clucas, and it's my pleasure to welcome one and all to our free monthly virtual What Talk series. Blimey, we've made it to number 10 already. Thanks so much to everyone who's contributed, attended live, or just watched one of our video recordings online at our website, whattalks.com, or the associated YouTube channel with a link on that first page there. For anyone new, WHAT stands for Waterside Hypotheses, Aquatic Theories, or whatever you like, really. If you look at the logo closely, you'll see the idea. In a nutshell, these ideas propose that the many peculiar physical differences between humans and chimpanzees are most plausibly explained by some kind of more aquatic past in our evolution. We think these ideas simply tick more evidential boxes than the savanna-based ones, which have dominated the mainstream for the best part of a century. So far in this series, we've heard from several specialists from different scientific fields who each gave their view as to how their speciality fitted in with the concept of a more aquatic past. Today, though, our guest speaker, Francesca Mansfield, will remind us that the views of generalists are very important too. Indeed, the main inspiration for most of us here was Elaine Morgan, very much a non-specialist. In all areas, specialists and generalists learn to work together and value each other's contributions. And on this, I'm reminded of Alistair Hardy's first published thoughts on Elaine. Most of us will know that 50 years ago, her bestseller, The Descent of Woman, was published. Before she did so, she wrote to Hardy, asking him if he'd mind, as the concept of a more aquatic past was his idea. Not only did he write back positively, encouraging her to do so, in 1981, he actually wrote a foreword for her next book called The Aquatic Ape. Hardy was very much a specialist. He was a marine biologist, while Elaine was definitely a generalist when it came to science. But Hardy was still very generous in his praise of her. I've actually got the book here. So this is her book, and I'm just going to read from the preface, from the foreword that Hardy wrote. He says, "Some critics are almost bound to suggest that little notice need be taken of her views because of her amateur status." And then he says, "As a professional zoologist, I would point out that some of the greatest contributors to evolution theory had no academic training in biology. Without suggesting that Elaine Morgan is a second Darwin, I would remind them that Darwin himself abandoned his medical course at Edinburgh and took a past degree in theology at Cambridge. Alfred Russel Wallace began his career as a land surveyor and never went to university at all. And Mendel entered a monastery at an early age." And then he says, "It is enthusiasm that carries people forward to add knowledge. Elaine Morgan has the zest, as will be seen in the following pages." Now, anyone that knows Francesca has heard her speak, and I think she's contributed to every single one of our meetings so far, will know that she also has an abundance of zest and enthusiasm about these subjects. She developed a passionate interest in the aquatic ape theory at the age of 17, having read The Descent of Woman, and has since tried to consume everything she could find by Elaine or anyone else on the subject. Francesca actually gave birth to her first child in water, inspired by Michelle Odom, one of our previous speakers. Her belief was that it would be a more natural, easier, and relatively painless way of childbirth, and she says it was. Since 2015, Francesca's been maintaining a website on the aquatic ape, or AAT as she prefers to call it. It's a great resource for keeping up with the latest scientific discoveries in these ideas, and I've put a link to it on ours. Francesca currently works as a yacht broker or charter operator in Greece. She's clearly drawn to the sea and loves being in it or on it whenever she can, and I must say that sounds lovely to me too. Now, let's get to the important business. Francesca is currently researching for and writing a book which has a working title similar to her talk today, Semi-Aquatic Human Ancestors, the evolution of a theory. It's based on the accumulating scientific evidence that supports aquatic or semi-aquatic adaptations in humans. Francesca kindly lent me a couple of chapters and extracts of it a few months ago, and I must say what I've read so far is great. Her research is really thorough and scholarly, and I can't wait to buy a copy when it's finished. But luckily for us today, Francesca is going to give us a preview and a summary of her book for free. All we have to do is sit back and listen. Before handing over, please remember to keep your microphone on mute for the duration of the talk. There will be time for questions and comments at the end. Right, enough of me. Down under here in cold, wet Perth. Let's now flip hemispheres, jump to the European summer, and join Francesca by the beautiful Mediterranean Sea in Greece, where I hear the cicadas are singing loudly.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alkis, for that introduction. You said a lot of the things I was going to say myself about how I feel a little bit of an imposter here after such prestigious speakers you've had previously. As you mentioned, Elaine Morgan has been a mentor of mine since I was very young, and in her later years we corresponded a little. She wrote to me in October 2011. She said, "I have certainly not given up hope that AAT, aquatic ape theory, the idea will be accepted, maybe not in my lifetime, but not too much later, I would think." And in a way, that's what prompted me to sort of pick up the baton, I suppose, and from a lay person's point of view, maybe try and carry on some of the things that she started by keeping the story going, and trying to generate more interest and trying to build a more solid scientific foundation, so that the naysayers could, fall back on the same sort of evidence that they use. Right, AAT, aquatic ape theory, or amphibious ape theory, or however you choose to call it. Among supporters, I think we all more or less agree that water has played a morphological role in the evolution of human ancestors, leading to many of the major differences between humans and the great apes. But we don't all necessarily agree on where this happened, when it happened, why it happened, how it happened, or who the last common ancestor of apes and humans may have been. And these were questions that intrigued me. I thought, well, apart from having read a lot about aquatic ape theory in Elaine Morgan's books, obviously, I didn't have any background in paleoanthropology or science. So I thought, well, the best way to learn about it is to read what the scientists themselves are writing, to read about the discoveries and the research and the evidence. And I've read, and I keep reading lots of scientific papers. And I find that many of the arguments or papers or evidence used to support traditional theories like savanna theories, then they no longer support the traditional paradigms of evolution. They just as easily support alternative paradigms. So you just need to look at it with a fresh eye. We all know that chimpanzees and humans are very similar genetically. Some people have even suggested that our species should be called pan sapiens, or is it Homo troglodytes or something like that along those lines. We're so similar genetically. But we all know that there are many obvious physical differences between us. We walk on two legs, whereas they walk on their knuckles. We have more or less naked bodies, where they seem to be covered in fur. We tend to put on a lot of weight. We sweat a lot. We have a large brain. We speak. So we consider ourselves a more advanced species. It's logical to assume, therefore, that many of the changes that happened to our lineage happened only to our lineage. It didn't happen to them. And that's based on a series of assumptions, which go back to the very early days of human evolution, early 19th century, for example. The last common ancestor, they think, must have looked like a chimpanzee, hairy, knuckle-walking quadruped. They think that chimpanzees haven't changed very much since we diverged from a common ancestor, only we've changed. And it's generally assumed that chimps are primitive and we are advanced. But in science, you're generally talking about primitive or advanced species. We're talking about whether they more closely resemble a previous ancestor or whether they've changed more from the previous ancestor than another line. I mean, if I ask, for example, who is the more advanced out of a chimpanzee, a gorilla, or a human being? Well, a lot of people would probably say, well, a gorilla, and then a chimpanzee, and then it's us. But the truth is, we're all equally advanced. We have all been evolving for the same amount of time since we split from our common ancestors. We've all been going along our own separate paths. We've all been changing in different ways and adapting to our environment. So really, we cannot say that we are more advanced or they're more primitive, but that's been the basis on which a lot of human evolution and anthropology is sort of the starting point, the foundation for it. There is a story that we all know, and it's still taught in schools, and it's the one that most people refer back to if you ask anyone about how did we become human. And it goes something like this. Once upon a time, human ancestors left the trees and they became bipedal on the African savanna. That's because when Lamarck and early Darwin, early anthropologists looked at the situation, they said, well, our closest relatives are chimpanzees. They live in Africa. What is Africa like? It's covered in savanna. Therefore, we must have come down from the trees and started running around on the savanna. There was no fossil evidence at the time to support any ideas like this. These were just assumptions. They developed their ideas to say that possibly we came down from the trees and started walking on two legs so that we could see further over the long grasses, or in order to expose less of our body to the midday sun, or so that we could carry tools and weapons. And then Elaine Morgan pointed out that they were forgetting the women, so they added babies to that list. They lost their fur so that they could keep cool on the savanna, or perhaps to get rid of parasites, or perhaps because it was more sexually attractive in that way. We all know that these arguments don't really stand up. They're all very flimsy, they're all very weak. The savanna theory has long since been discredited, as we know, and we now know that during the Pliocene, when a lot of these fossil hominids lived, Africa wasn't savanna. It was a mosaic of many different environments, including some savanna, some forests, but many wetlands as well. So keeping the story more or less the same, they then just said, okay, well, it wasn't savanna, it was a mosaic of lands, but we got bigger brains because we started hunting animals and eating meat. And then we developed tools and culture and language and so on. That's pretty much the story that we still have today. And it doesn't answer many questions, but it's the one that most people fall back on. That's all they know. So I decided I'm going to start my research, chose a random time, when apes first diverged from old world monkeys, when the first ape species appear in a way. So that would be 25 million years ago. Okay, there are arguments that apes may have evolved in Asia or at an earlier time and so on. I'm starting my story 25 million years ago because that's where I read about some of the environmental conditions in Africa. And 25 million years ago, the East African seaboard began to rift and uplift. This caused many of the rivers running down to the sea to run backwards. It caused huge flooded areas in the Rift Valley. Lakes appeared, flooded forests, many islands were created in the middle of these vast lakes, and it's on those islands that many fossil apes have been found. So yes, the oldest fossils that maybe show an ape might be also dating from 25.2 million years ago. I'm not going to try and read those names, I'm sure I'd say it wrong. But they found two species side by side that one of them aligns more closely with the apes. It's larger and heavier, and the smaller one they think was still arboreal. I think perhaps the first one, the heavier one, may have started living on the ground or closer to the ground. I thought that the environmental situation there may have played a role. If you were used to running around in the treetops and having the whole of the African forests as your playground, and then it all became flooded and you were separated by islands into little groups, then some of these apes, these arboreal primates, may have decided to climb down and look for food elsewhere, possibly in the water at the bottom of the trees. A key species from that period, the early Miocene, is Ugandapithecus. key genus, I should say. They were rather different species. And it lived for a long time. Most of the fossils come from gallery forest, and there are fossils there also of many aquatic species found along with it. So it's clear it lived in a very watery environment. We should remember that in the early Miocene, global temperatures were a lot hotter than they are today. I mean, look at what 1 degree is causing, chaos is causing. It was about 8 degrees hotter then. It was very humid. There was a lot of rainfall, very tropical. I mean, these species could not have avoided water, even if they'd wanted to. A lot of their environment consisted of lakes, rivers, swamps, marshes, mangroves, and gallery forests. Over the 6 million year period that Ugandapithecus was around in Uganda, that's what it's named for, it shows progressively that it grew larger over time. This is something that happens to many aquatic animals because they're not encumbered by gravity, let's say, and also being larger in water means you can preserve your body temperature and stay in the water longer. They became more orthograde or more upright, so it showed that they were perhaps climbing up and down tree trunks more and possibly standing on their legs or wading in the water. They had flatter faces, which might indicate that they were already reducing their sense of smell. And smell is another thing that we don't need so much in water. It doesn't work as well. So all of those may be indications that Ugandapithecus, as one species of early ape, was becoming more and more aquatic during that period. Another species that's important and keeps coming up in a lot of papers is Moritopithecus bishopi. It's considered by some to be the first fully orthograde ape, and orthograde meaning with a vertical spine where you support your weight in a vertical position rather than a quadrupedal or horizontal position. Those are the main differences between apes and monkeys. So we see that this is when the ape body plan was being designed or coming into form. They still had suspensory adaptations, which means they still lived in the trees. But the thigh shaft on Moritopithecus was very short and very heavy. And as Mark has said for a long time, this is an indication it's often found in shallow diving or wading animals. Heavier leg bones means that you can be more firmly rooted in water and not be washed away by the currents, for example. Moritopithecus also had very low lumbar vertebrae, so that suggesting it did spend a lot of its time upright. It lived in a shallow wetland full of sedges. We've all seen sedges are something that gorillas still eat and they wade for. They'll wade out on 2 legs into pools to collect sedges. Their thick molar enamel confirms that they ate this kind of food. And in one paper, the writer said that the changes we see in Moritopithecus may have been driven by modifications in substrate use consistent with changes in resource acquisition. In other words, it changed to its body to facilitate its foraging behavior, which possibly means wading in water to get to the sedges. Okay, and according to A.J. Filler, Moritopithecus was the original hominiform upright biped. So he's sort of saying, forget all these arguments about we became bipedal on the savannah in the Pliocene. Apes have actually been bipedal since 20 million years ago. Or at least not maybe habitually bipedal like we are, but posturally bipedal. They certainly stand on 2 legs. And as Algis has shown us, it's not exactly rocket science. It makes a lot of sense to walk into water on 2 legs instead of 4 if you want to keep your head free and not drown. It's another, you can also, your hands are free to harvest, gather food or carry babies. So the same arguments they used for the savannah, but here instead you've actually got a real reason why you would go through all that pain and struggle to stand on 2 legs when your body prefers to go on to 4. Going on 4 legs is obviously faster, more efficient. You don't get all the problems that we have today walking on 2 legs, lumbar problems and the rest of it. So there must have been a very compelling reason for some apes to actually stand on 2 legs most of the time and change their bodies in that way. Another thing that is often attributed to the differences between humans and apes is fur loss. But in my research, I discovered that this isn't something stemming from just the human lineage. If you look at the evidence, it shows that probably all apes went through a period where they lost some of their fur. Today, all apes lack an undercoat of fur. They technically don't have fur, they have hair, which is a different form than fur. They lack fur. Gorilla and chimps lack fur on their faces, ears, and fingers. Gorillas lack hair on their chests. When they are in the womb, chimpanzee fetuses grow hair only in the last month of gestation, which suggests this is a late stage acquisition where they're growing fur back again. They lost at some point and then grew it back. And a scientific paper shows that chimpanzees have a much reduced hair follicle density compared to macaques, suggesting that hair density was reduced in a common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans. So that was a surprise to me. It's probably a surprise to some people. It's suggesting that it's not that humans lost their fur, but that all ape ancestors lost their fur at some point. But then the other apes, the extant apes today, have grown it back again, whereas we didn't. According to Schultz back in 1925, he talked about lots of differences between humans and the apes, and came to the conclusion that, in fact, the human body is in many points less specialized than the other primates, and is in fact actually more primitive than other primates. In other words, the ancestor of us all may be closer to humans than to apes. They have changed more than we have. Okay, anyway, I'll go on with it because that's controversial in itself. Tail loss is another thing that distinguishes apes from monkeys. Scientists say we apparently paid a cost for the loss of the tail, and we still feel the echoes. We must have had a clear benefit for losing the tail, whether it was improved locomotion or something else. Nobody actually knows why we lost our tails, why apes lost their tails, but there are a few theories. This is a picture of Proconsul, which some scientists believe is like one of the first apes. Or I don't necessarily, but the reason they think it didn't have a tail is because they've never found a tail, but that's been disputed because apparently the final vertebrate that they found have some tendon attachments which suggest there may have been a tail. We just haven't found it yet. Anyway, it was still arboreal, so I don't see why it would need to lose its tail. Many aquaboreal mammals, now that's a term that Mark uses a lot, aquaboreal meaning that they live in the trees and the water. Many aquaboreal mammals lose their tails, for example, sloths, black macaques, pig-tailed langurs, and many semi-aquatic mammals either lose or reduce their tails, for example, pigs or hippos or elephants. Now, there is a reason why you might lose your tail if you're spending a lot of time in water. There are several reasons. One, it creates drag and slows you down, unless you are entering the water on all fours and using your tail for propulsion, as well, whales and dolphins do. They just got rid of their legs instead. They kept the tail and got rid of the legs. But if you're going in on your limbs, you don't need your tail. So another reason might be to reduce heat loss through the tail. If it's not helping you in the trees anymore, it's unnecessary, really. It could be a source of infection, and it might make make it easier for predators to grab hold of you and eat you. So those are all possible reasons why apes may have lost their tails in water. And that goes back again, tail loss to the early Miocene. Body fat, another human characteristic. It actually exists in all great apes. They don't get as fat as we do these days because they're probably a bit more careful with their diets. But animals that are kept in zoos and fed food that we tend to eat can put on a lot of weight. Recent research suggests a uricase mutation around 15 million years ago may have led to obesity in the ancestors of all apes, which they put down to perhaps it was a way of converting fructose into fat at a time of scarcity. But another reason might be aquatic or semi-aquatic, because we know that most, or perhaps all aquatic mammals, fully aquatic mammals, have a thick layer of subcutaneous fat, which helps them keep warm in water, and it also helps them stay afloat. So all of those things kind of suggesting that perhaps early ape ancestors were more semi-aquatic than apes are today at one time. Eccrine glands. Now, this is another thing that's supposedly unique to us. Most animals have 99% apocrine glands, which are used for scent signaling, and only 1% eccrine glands, which reduce moisture. Humans, on the other hand, complete opposite. We have very few apocrine glands where we produce odor, and our bodies are covered in eccrine glands. The other apes and macaques, gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees, have more of an equal ratio, 52 to 48%. But chimps have increased eccrine gland glycogen content capillarization. What that maybe means is that they can transfer more water and sugar and energy through their sweat glands into the blood vessels. So could that be related? According to most scientists, we're covered in eccrine glands because it's a unique sweating mechanism, that we involved it so that we could cool down on the savannah, which is absolutely ridiculous because it's very inefficient as a cooling system. If you live somewhere where there isn't plenty of fresh water, it takes too long to kick in. You need to replace the water and salt you lose very quickly, or you can dehydrate and die very, very quickly. The only place something like this is possible is where you are close to water all the time and you can replace the water. Gareth Morgan has done some work himself where he suggested that something called reverse transdermal osmosis may be the reason for it, because all aquatic mammals have lost their apocrine glands as well. There's no need for them to smell or produce scents for other animals to communicate. What Gareth was suggesting, and he's done some work on this and some experiments on this, and maybe, I don't know, he should talk about it at some point, but just very quickly, we know that we can release salt and water through our eccrine glands to cool down. Not what many people don't know, and not enough work has been done to establish, is whether they can work in the opposite direction and absorb water and salt and regulate water and salt. In other words, if you have no access at all to water, or very little, limited access to water, if you spend all day up to your neck in the sea, can you actually absorb water that way and require less water overall? Gavin's experiments have somehow suggested that this may be possible, but I think more research is needed on that. It's interesting nonetheless. Anyway, that's the early Miocene. Moving on now towards the middle Miocene. My path sort of ended in Africa. I found that from 14 million years ago, more or less all the apes just disappear. There aren't any ape fossils. They've all gone. Where did they go? Well, they went across the land bridge around 15 million years ago when the Mesopotamian seaway closed, and they entered Eurasia. And from there, they just took off. They went mad, according to Bacon. It was the planet of the apes. They spread and diversified, and there are literally hundreds of species of fossil apes in Eurasia from 14 million to 10 million years ago. And yet we still talk only about Africa. Nobody's really talking about Eurasia, even though the trail runs cold in Africa. So that surprised me, and I thought, well, I'll investigate this a bit further. And I started reading about all the different fossil ape species from Eurasia. There are now many scientists who fully support the idea that the great apes actually migrated out of Africa into Eurasia and there took off as the ancestors of great apes, the hominoids. According to Bacon, Sivapithecus, maybe the ancestors of orangutan, went east, and Drypithecus, the ancestors of the other great apes, went west into Europe. And during the mid-Miocene, Europe would have been a perfect habitat for aquaboreal apes. Before 11 million years ago, it was very wet, very humid, full of forests, very similar to the Africa they left behind. And the Africa they left behind was drying out. That's the time when the forests did start to disappear in Africa, but there were plenty of forests still in Europe. In fact, Europe was a very watery habitat back then. As you can see from this map, much of the Europe we know today was underwater. And many of the fossil ape species found from that period, the mid-Miocene, are found, I think probably all of them are found near water. 15 to 40 million years ago, something called the Langian transgression or the Badinian flooding meant that huge areas of Central Europe were flooded. There were forests everywhere, water everywhere, and this is where all the apes lived happily at the time. This may have been the age of the aquaboreal apes, and again, a mention to Mark Verheegen there, who has often talked about aquaboreal apes. Whether it was Africa or Europe, it seems to me that the overwhelming number of apes were from Europe at this time. And one such example, Danuvius gugamosi, only recently discovered, dating to 11.62 million years ago from the Molasse Basin in Bavaria, found also with mollusks, fish, and other reptiles. It had increased lumbar vertebra, which means a long back, a long spine, especially a long lower back, which is found in humans because we need to support our weight on those vertebrae. It had a low diaphragm, which might suggest it had expanded lung capacity. Its knees had weight-bearing ability. And according to Madeline Burma, who wrote about it in her book, and she wrote the papers on this, because she discovered it basically with her students, she wrote in Ancient Bones that Danuvius looked like an ape from the waist up, but like an early hominin from the waist down. Another species that seems significant, genus, species, Rhodopithecus hungarius, from about 10 million years ago, from what was now Hungary, according to Bagan, may have been the first great ape, or even a basal or a stem hominin. So it could have been at the very beginning of the lineage leading to us. Certainly, he thinks the lineage leading to gorillas, chimpanzees, and us. It also had a very long, flexible lower back and a short pelvis, which is not like chimpanzees or gorillas today, but more like our back. And Carol Ward, who wrote about the species, wrote, when Rhodopithecus came down to the ground, it might have had the ability to stand upright more like humans do. This evidence supports the idea that rather than asking why human ancestors stood up from all fours, perhaps we should be asking why our ancestors never dropped down on all fours in the first place. So again, this is sort of showing that our early ancestors and the ancestors of all apes may have been more upright and already partially bipedal, already wading, already foraging in aquatic resources well before we split and went our separate ways. But then everything changed. The story changes around 11 million years ago when the Valencian crisis began. This was caused by the Himalayas being pushed up, and the whole global climate was changing. In the Northern Hemisphere, the weather became more seasonal. The tropical forest was gradually replaced by savanna and hard-leafed woodland. So a lot of the fruit trees the apes depended on disappeared. There would have been less rainfall overall, more seasonal rainfall, and many large predators have suddenly appeared. I mean, this is when we get the first Hipparian horses, and followed closely behind are saber-toothed cats and early forms of hyena and wolverines and all sorts of nasty animals with big teeth. So many apes start to disappear around this time as well. In fact, maybe this is the savanna environment that they had envisaged in Africa. It's suddenly now appearing in the mid to late Miocene in Europe. It's around this time also that it's thought that the gorilla lineage diverged from the chimpanzee human lineage. And one possible contender who may be closely related to the gorilla line, or possibly all of us still, is Oranopithecus, found in Greece and Turkey from around 9.6 million years ago to 7.4 million years ago. It also lived in flooded river valleys around the Proto-Black Sea, the Tethys then. It ate aquatic plants or C3 plants, roots, tubers. It had very similar dental morphology to a genus called Nacalipithecus from Kenya, and also to Australopithecus afarensis, who is better known, of course, as Lucy from East Africa, and gorilla. All of these three have been linked in many features. They were sexually dimorphic. The males were bigger than the females. It was probably bipedal. It seemed to live on the ground. It was about the same size and shape to a gorilla. And so, yes, it could have been a common ancestor of gorilla or just closely related. I mean, I can't state, nobody can say with any certainty what the phylogenetic relationships are. But one idea I had was that if Oranopithecus was still in Greece 9.6 million years ago, perhaps something similar branched off from it and made its way back to Africa at that time, when Africa was beginning to become more habitable again. And the connection with this species and the African species that come later means that's a possible lineage there, a route. A lot of animals from Europe migrated back to Africa during this period after the Miocene. Hippos, elephants, the ancestor of all these animals, giraffes and so on, were starting to migrate back into Africa. And yet nobody considers that an ape might have done it too. In fact, according to the main researchers of Oranopithecus, they said that if this species, this fossil, had been found in Africa, then everybody would have jumped up and said it's a human ancestor. But because it was found in Europe, it's basically been disregarded. Doesn't fit the paradigm. Another species from Europe, Grecopithecus freybergi, who lived 7.2 million years ago, has been found in Greece. Well, a jawbone was found in Greece and a tooth was found in Bulgaria. That's about all that exists of it at the moment. But that's still enough for them to put together quite a lot of information. Again, according to Madeline Verma in her book Ancient Bones and various papers that I've read, it lived in braided river landscapes in Greece and Bulgaria, always close to water. Water's found very close. It ate cattails, and she describes those cattails as being 2 or 3 meters tall at the time, growing out of rivers. And perhaps that would have been a refuge for these bipedal wading apes who had no tree cover anymore, somewhere they could hide from the big land predators that were chasing them around. From the teeth alone, they found that their teeth were very similar to our teeth, to the teeth of Homo, as opposed to Pan chimpanzees, because it had fused roots, unlike chimpanzee roots, which are more splayed. And they wrote a paper suggesting that Grecopithecus, or El Greco, may have been the last common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, possibly even the first hominin on the human lineage after the split. And again, this doesn't really tie in with this established paradigm, so it's generally been ignored and disregarded as an idea. So who was the last common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans? This is a question that nobody's answered yet. They still try and, whenever they find an older fossil that appears to be bipedal, they say, this must be the first human ancestor on the human line because it started walking around. Well, bonobos frequently wade and walk bipedally. In fact, gorillas can do it too. And some research has shown that lowland gorillas actually spend more time on 2 legs than they do on walking on their knuckles, especially when they're foraging. You can see in this picture of a bonobo, she also lacks fur and has fatty breasts. Bonobos in general are more matriarchal and more peaceful society than chimpanzees. They can mate face to face. They sometimes have webbed feet, and their leg muscles are very similar to human leg muscles. So this led me to conclude, or to think, to ask questions. Was the last common ancestor perhaps already partially bipedal, wading in water, partially furless, a little bit fat, able to use stone tools? We know that chimpanzees can use tools, and well, all apes, in fact, can use tools. Even orangutans have been shown making their own tools. And because they had 50-50 more or less eccrine glands, were they already adapting their eccrine gland system towards a more aquatic rather than terrestrial environment? Was it in fact chimpanzees that have diverged more from the last common ancestor than humans, over time becoming more arboreal, regrowing their fur, dropping onto their knuckles, while we carried on whatever we were doing, we carried on doing it. And here we are today. Okay, next stage that I saw for an aquatic history. This is, to me, this paper was a game changer in a way. Again, another paper that's been completely disregarded by the scientific community. Bipedal human-like footprints were found in Trachulos in Crete in 2002, but not published until 2015 because the author, Gerard Gilinski, couldn't find anyone who would accept his paper for so many years. It was rejected and rejected and rejected because it didn't fit any of the standard paradigms. They all said to him, come on, how could there have been bipedal hominins walking around in the Mediterranean 6 million years ago? We all know that they were in Africa 3 million years ago. Didn't make any sense at all, so it was basically ignored. But since then, many scientists have come together. They've examined all the evidence. They've looked at the date. They all agree the dating is around 6 million old is correct. Most of them agree that the footprint, the track makers were bipedal and their feet were very like ours because they had an adducted hallux. That means the big toe was in line with the other toes. There was a slight arch to the foot, which helps when you're walking and putting your weight on your foot. A large ball where you push off when you're taking footsteps, strides. A narrow heel, and there was a range of sizes here: infants, children, and adults, all running around on the coast in Crete at a time when the sea was beginning to evaporate. Now, Crete actually separated from the Greek mainland around 10 million years ago and then reconnected again to the mainland probably around this time, 5.9 million years ago, when the Mediterranean salinity crisis began. So there's a question there. Who were they? Who were these people? Hominids, hominins, apes, or whatever they were that left the footprints on the coast of Crete? Could they have been related to Uranopithecus? Could they have been related to El Greco? We know those were the survivors around the southern Mediterranean coasts in the late Miocene. And much has been made about the Laetoli footprints from East Africa, which they think were made by Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis. You can see a couple of photos there on the right. The toes are in fact more splayed in that foot than they are on the Trachulos prints. And there were several species of bipedal hominid we know walking around Africa at that time, and they haven't yet fully understood or agreed who made the prints. Okay, the next major event that happened around this time, when I was doing my research, was of course the Mediterranean Mycenaean salinity crisis, the MSC. Between 5.9 and 5.3 million years ago, the Mediterranean Sea basically dried up. The gates at Gibraltar closed, the water from the Atlantic stopped coming in, and over a very short period of time, relatively speaking, that water evaporated, leaving huge salt basins at the bottom of the Med, which are still there today. This caused most of the large fauna in the area to go extinct or to migrate away from the area. And what was left of the giraffes, elephants, hippos, and so on, ancestors all went back into Africa. Where did our ancestors go? That's the question. If we were there, if they were part of that European southern Med population, where could we have gone? Back to Africa? Well, that would fit in with the paradigms that starts off with Sahelanthropus tridensis, a fossil species found that lived 7 million years ago. When it was discovered at the time, there was a lot of noise made because they thought possibly it walked on 2 legs and therefore it must be the earliest human ancestor. Because if it walked on 2 legs, it must be human, right? That's the assumption. Still, papers have come out since then disputing that it was ever bipedal, capable of bipedalism, and others have said it resembles more a female gorilla than any human ancestor. And again, I think that ties in possibly with the Uranopithecus or something similar that migrated from Europe back into Africa and may have started the gorilla lineage. It also lived, close to water. And then we have the Australopithecines. Of course, this forms the basic narrative now that we have of our evolution in Africa. We are told that because they resemble something transitional between humans and apes, they are this intermediary stage between humans and apes. All the features that look chimpanzee-like are primitive, and all the features that look human, like bipedalism, are advanced and modern. Most of the Australopithecines have this mixture of features. They have some features that make them closer to the apes and some features that should make them closer to us, mainly bipedalism. But some of them existed at the same time as Homo, so there's no clear link. Nobody's ever established a link between which of these species may have eventually led to the human lineage. And the evidence shows that many species actually became more arboreal over time, not more terrestrial. Later Australopithecines tend to be smaller, with even smaller brains and more arboreal features. It's also intriguing that till now they haven't really found any evidence of the ancestors of chimpanzees or gorillas in Africa. No fossils have been attributed to them, apart from perhaps one or two small teeth, which they say maybe. It makes you wonder, because of course everybody wants to, anyone who finds a fossil wants it to be a human ancestor fossil, because that's where all the prestige is, that's where all the money goes, that's where all the investment is. It's difficult to sort of say, well, actually, this might just be a monkey fossil or a chimpanzee fossil or something like that. But the truth is, when you read the papers about these species, I've read them with an open mind. Almost every paper will say such and such feature is closer to chimpanzee, or such and such feature is similar to gorilla, without really saying, could these actually be ancestors of gorillas or chimpanzees? One paper that was interesting said, let's redo the facial reconstructions. We've all seen sort of artists' impressions of Lucy, of what they think she might have looked like in the Smithsonian, where they make her look kind of a bit more human than a bit more than ape-like. Well, using the most modern techniques, some scientists redid the facial reconstructions, and here on the left you have what Lucy may have looked like, and on the right what the Taung child might have looked like. And as you can see, Lucy in this representation looks more like a gorilla, and the Taung child looks more like a chimpanzee, perhaps. And there are more and more scientists, or academics, various people starting to say now, and Mark has been saying it for years, Lucy was no human ancestor. The Australopithecines are not human ancestor. They're not related to us. They're the ancestors of the African apes. And instead of assuming that we started off on 4 legs and made our way up to 2, you can start thinking it another way. Perhaps the common ancestor was on 2 legs already, and for some reason the ancestors of gorillas and chimpanzees dropped down onto their knuckles at a later date, in parallel for different reasons, but presumably a similar environment, because maybe they stopped wading. Maybe they just returned to the forests and regrew their fur when they didn't need to be naked anymore. So the ancestors of the African apes were the Australopithecines, in fact, the ancestor of African apes. This is a reverse picture, in a way, of the stages of regression, the march of progress. Did chimpanzees descend from a partially upright bipedal furless tool-using common ancestor, and gradually over time return to the trees? There's just an image I found on the internet, which I don't necessarily agree with the pattern or the grouping here, but you can see in this one, somebody's already grouped the Australopithecines on the left-hand side over here, with a branch leading to chimpanzees and bonobos. So Lucy's species, they're putting it with chimpanzees and bonobos. Homo is a different group in the middle, and Paranthropus, some of those may be closer related to gorilla. Now, when the Homo genus appeared around 2 million years ago, some scientists were amazed at the differences. They said, okay, this is clearly, there's no obvious connection here between this species and the Australopithecines in Africa. Suddenly Homo was a lot taller, limb proportions completely different, very long arms, very long legs, more gracile, bigger brain, expanded thoracic lung volume. And in one paper that I read, I think these were all quite interesting. This is by Hawkes et al., written 2000. They said that the anatomy of the earliest Homo, they were talking about erectus, but they're actually calling all Homo sapiens in this paper, indicates significant modifications of the ancestral genome and is not simply an extension of evolutionary trends in earlier Australopithecine lineage throughout the Pliocene. In fact, its combination of features never appears earlier. Some of its characteristics are unique, such as the very large body sizes and long legs. They said, prior to the emergence of Homo, the entire human species was limited to 1,000 to several thousand individuals. This was based on genomic studies that they did, molecular genomics, things like that. They decided that it was almost as if humans, Homo, appeared as if from nowhere, and they came from a very small population. They said it went through a bottleneck, and they said that this bottleneck would have had to have been of sufficient duration to allow for fixation by drift of a single ancestral mitochondrial DNA variant. In other words, the human ancestor population would have been very small and isolated by itself for a very long period of time in order to create this new species that emerged around 2 million years ago. They went on to say that perhaps 100,000 individuals lived for 1 million years or more in an area the size of Rhode Island or Swaziland, which I think is around 3,000 square miles or kilometers, can't remember which. And they lived as a separate species, separate from the Australopithecines, separate from the other apes. This species would presumably be the direct ancestor of modern humans, Homo sapiens. And they said that all the current available genetic, paleontological, and archaeological data are consistent with a bottleneck in our lineage more or less 2 million years ago. And another reason why our ancestors probably were not in Africa, quite an important one. Between 3 and 4 million years ago, there was a virus that affected all the apes in Africa. The TERV1 or SERV1 virus appears in all extant African apes and Old World monkeys, but not in Asian apes or Homo. Chimpanzees have 130 copies of this retrovirus. We have none. And even though they've tried, many people have tried to come up with explanations for why this might be the case, they've been unable to do so. One team in 2007 who tried to suggest that maybe we had some kind of enzyme that destroyed all the evidence of this virus in the past, couldn't come up with any evidence for this. And they concluded that human ancestors must have occupied an ecological niche that physically separated them from the source of this infectious virus. So if they weren't in Africa during the Pliocene, where were our human ancestors? This was a question that intrigued me the most. Okay, well, I thought let's look at the timings a little bit. There's a lot of disagreement about this as well, but it's generally agreed, according to the molecular clock estimates, that it was between 4.4 or 6.2 million years ago when we split. Average, okay, around about 5 million years ago. Chimpanzees and bonobos, or Pan, went one way and we went another way. But why did this happen? Must have been something significant that caused us to separate completely from them at this time. I thought, well, in order to answer this question, I thought what we've been talking about, the last evidence we had was from Crete 6 million years ago, and they seem to have been walking around near the beaches then. We know that somehow the ancestors of gorillas and chimpanzees certainly ended up in Africa, but the ancestors of human beings, where did they go? So I thought, let's go back to Crete and pick up the trail from there. 5.3 million years ago, there was something called the Zanclean flood. It was a mega flood. And basically the whole of the Mediterranean basin refilled very, very quickly when the Straits of Gibraltar opened up again and the Atlantic came flooding in. So great was this flood that it encompassed the Red Sea. It broke through the straits of the Sinai Peninsula, and it cut off the land bridge between Eurasia and Africa once again. They think the whole Mediterranean may have refilled in less than 2 years. That's quite a flood. This is, okay, so this is what, more or less, this is where I leave. Everything I've said before is supported by peer-reviewed papers or research I've done. This is where I pick up the story on my own and run with it a little bit. This is what I'm calling my Zanclean flood hypothesis. Where did Pan and Homo diverge? Well, if the Mediterranean had flooded and crossed this land bridge here between the Arabian Peninsula and Africa, any species that were migrating around the Anatolian Peninsula from Europe having crossed into Africa here, some of them obviously would have gotten through, 5.3 million years ago exactly, that would have been separated and they would have been stranded on the Arabian Peninsula. Madeline Burma, again, in one of her papers, wrote about the hyper-aridity of the Arabian Peninsula at that time. It was just a lifeless desert. Nothing grew there, nothing lived there. There were no trees, nothing. The only place where there was life, and plenty of it, was on the coast of the Red Sea. So where is a place where, close to Africa, where human ancestors may have been separated forcibly from chimpanzee cousins, where they may have been forced into a coastal existence, where they would have found everything they need to survive in terms of food, because if they were already bipedal, already coastally adapted, and already eating shellfish, it wouldn't have been difficult for them to carry on that lifestyle. It was very, very hot. Again, 6 or 7 degrees higher than today, global temperatures. Sea levels then would have been 30 meters higher than they are today. And so there were plenty of shallow coastal shelves and there would have been plenty to eat. I wondered whether perhaps if the human ancestors were stuck on the Red Sea coast and the rest that made it across continued down on the other side, they eventually became the Australopithecines, they eventually became chimpanzees a lot long later when they moved more inland into the woods and forests. What about, I've written Panhomer ? Pointing east, because there may have been even earlier migrations east from that point, from the last common ancestor, or from that small stranded Homo group, but it would have been difficult to cross the Arabian Peninsula unless they went just along rivers and lakes, and so eventually ended up going east. And we do know that there are fossils from the Far East very early that puzzle paleoanthropologists. They don't always know where they come from, who they were, and perhaps even species like Homo floresiensis or Homo lusiensis, who, okay, they come much, much later, but they seem to be, originally it was thought maybe they were descended from Homo erectus, but now they think maybe they're descended from an earlier version of Homo erectus, an early Homo species. So perhaps there was an earlier wave that managed to cross and go east at that point. Anyway, the Red Sea is approximately the size of Rhode Island. There are no trees there, so there would have been no modifications towards arborealism. If we were already walking around and shallow diving, we just got very good at doing it there. The Red Sea today is one of the most diverse places in the world for aquatic life, abundance of sea lice, hundreds of species of clams, shellfish, seabird eggs, turtles, edible seaweeds. There are no crocodiles. Okay, there are sharks, but sharks even today are not really a big problem for humans. And imagine in that heat, if you've got no shade, you've got no forest, you've got nowhere else to go, where are you going to go? You're going to go into the water. I know I want to do it when it gets hot here. It cools you down, and if you've got food there and everything you need there, you'd probably spend most of your day in the water or cooling off in the shallow waters. That's where we possibly acquired most of the characteristics that I won't go into detail now. If you're interested in this and you don't know about it, read Elaine Morgan's books. Such as larger, fatter bodies, longer legs, larger lung capacity, well-developed diving reflexes, equine glands all over our bodies, multi-pyramidal kidneys for salt regulation, huge spleens for diving, larger brains from the seafood that we eat, diving and breathing modifications from having to forage underwater for food, large fatty breasts for feeding babies in water, longer penises, perhaps for mating in water, hymens, earwax, babies that float and swim from the minute they're born, a hooded nose that protects our nostrils from water getting in, menopause, which only appears in aquatic species, a naked skin, and so much more. If I'm suggesting that the ancestors of all apes may have partially gone this way, what I'm saying here is that we fully immersed ourselves at this point, and they didn't. They went back another way. They did a U-turn. And there's one more thing that I found that was also interesting. Humans, unlike all the other apes, have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 chromosomes. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans have 48. Nobody knows exactly why this happened or when this happened, but research indicates that it may have occurred 4.5 to 2.5 million years ago, during a bottleneck when our ancestors were genetically isolated. That fits with the Red Sea period that I'm talking about. The fusion of these chromosomes is linked to higher cognitive functions, an upright posture, and the authors wrote about endurance running. Well, they didn't think of other endurance activities such as diving, swimming, and so on. And also it's linked to an enhanced sweating capacity, or perhaps a change in the way that we modulate our salt and water levels. According to one author, it was a one-off mutation that arose only once, likely in one early modern human male, and was subsequently transmitted and accumulated as a heterozygous event, converted to the homozygous state due to inbreeding in a small bottleneck polygamous clan, and spread in the succeeding populations. In other words, a very lucky Adam surrounded by lots of Eves may have been the sole culprit of this fused chromosome that transmitted to the rest of us. It kind of suggests that human ancestors went through such a bottleneck that there were maybe only a handful, a very small number, survived this period on the Red Sea. And it was only when the Pleistocene began, 2.5 million years ago, when sea levels fell dramatically, when finally the Red Sea, the Arabian Peninsula, were reconnected to Africa, that this new species with 23 chromosomes started to explode and migrate in all directions at once. They were obviously bigger, better, and faster than before. And Homo erectus, well, there's lots of versions of Homo erectus, lots of arguments about whether we're talking about the same species, if we're talking about Homo ugaster or the Dmanisi specimens and various others. But just for the sake of convenience, I'm going to call them all Homo erectus here. The species that emerged, the first Homo species, had heavy bones, as Mark again has pointed out many times, would not have been capable of running across a savanna with such heavy bones. It probably would have broken its legs if it tried. It had an enormous thoracic capacity, so it had large lungs. It had flat skull caps with eyes near the top, which I think Simon or somebody else has mentioned before, how this would help if you were swimming more than walking or running, because you'd be able to keep your eyes looking ahead of you. They had much larger brains. That would be due to an aquatic diet. They had tools, which gradually, as an industry that developed and became more sophisticated over time. Again, Gareth has written about that and the possibility that their tools were not used for hunting and killing antelope and so on, but actually for opening shellfish. And all their fossils are found near water. There's no evidence of hunting or carnivory in Homo erectus, and yet the paradigm that that's how we became human, by running across the savannah, chasing and killing animals, is still the one that everybody sticks to. If they had started in the Red Sea, it would more easily explain how evidence of human activity, early human activity, appears almost simultaneously in various corners of the world, because some of the oldest tools and fossils come from 2.1 million years ago in eastern China and 2.4 million years ago in South Africa, which are very far apart. And this has, of course, caused many discussions and arguments between Chinese and the rest of the world about where humans evolved. To me, it makes much more sense if they were somewhere more central than that. Now, it may not have been the Red Sea. Over the 3 million years of the Pliocene or so, they may have been spreading around the Arabian Peninsula, following the coasts all the way around, and already had made their way across towards India, Pakistan, where we have tools from 1.9 million years ago in Pakistan. We have the Dmanisi specimens, fossils from Georgia to the north, 1.8 million years ago. Plenty of Java man, Homo erectus fossils in Indonesia. And as time goes on, we find more and more of them spreading around the world. Even 900,000 years ago, Homo erectus was back in Crete, or was in Crete, let's say, because there's evidence of tools there as well. Homo erectus, that lived for almost 2 million years, reached islands and continents that were surrounded by sea. Nobody knows how they got there. There have been lots of discussion. Did they swim there? Did they use elephants? Did they build watercraft? Well, if they were quite well aquatically adapted, any of those are possible, I suppose. I think that Homo erectus was probably more aquatic than we are today, and that since humans appeared, since Homo sapiens, our species appeared, we have become more terrestrial and started to lose some of our swimming and diving features. And yeah, Homo sapiens basically 300,000 years or so ago emerged as a more terrestrial species. They had longer, thinner legs. They weren't as robust as the Neanderthals or erectors. Their bodies were more gracile. They had a larger brain, sophisticated tools, not larger than Neanderthal, by the way. And possibly it was Homo sapiens that really became the first hunters and killers, because it seems that everywhere they went afterwards, everywhere we went, everything else disappeared. And that's about it, really. That's where I got to with my research. So happy to take any questions.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Francesca. That's so rich and so much stuff there. I'm sure everyone's got lots of questions. I've got a couple I want to jump in straight away. I just want to say that a lot of, I don't know how many of the citations that Francesca made during her talk, but a lot of them are on the website. We've got a big list of references, and we'll try to get maybe a few more of those added as well. So if anyone wants to find out, I mean, I've got lots of them, but I won't bore people with the details. And I'm interested in where you got some of this information from, because it's fascinating stuff. But I mean,
well, I've been keeping the references throughout my research, and I do have pages and pages and pages of references for things I've come across. So yes, if anybody specifically wants to know which paper or which evidence I've used for this comment, then I'd be happy to put a link to that. I'll give you that information.
One point, sort of question, and then I'll throw it open. I can see Mark's got his hand up, so Mark can go first probably. So I mean, my point is, this subject of the Miocene apes, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, there's so many genera. And I don't know about you, but I'm a very skeptical about the reality of there being so many different species and genera. I mean, a lot of this is on the basis of a tooth, because of course the tooth is the most likely thing to fossilize. But I don't know. I mean, maybe Simon might chip in as well later on. But I've always thought there can't have been so many genera. There must be a manifestation of humans, paleanthropologists, putting these things into pigeonholes and giving them labels that are so different. Was that your feeling when you come across all these different genera as well as species? Did it not occur to you that they're all very similar? Isn't it just an exaggeration? What do you think?
Well, I think that it's wrong to think that we can trace a direct ancestry through any fossil species. I mean, obviously we don't have DNA for most of them, so we won't be able to do that. All we can do is look at the bones and see how close morphologically they are to each other, and try and establish phylogenetic relationships based on similarities and differences and locations and times and so on. I think of evolution as being more like a bush rather than a tree even. I mean, I think that when you have a species, it can radiate in so many directions and become so many more different species, many of which will go extinct and disappear and will leave no fossil trace whatsoever. The ones that we do have just give us a tiny picture, a tiny window into the past. And again, we can't establish and say, oh, well, that looked like us, it must be a human ancestor. We have to forget all that way of thinking. All we can do is say, well, perhaps this one was related to that one, perhaps this one went in a completely different direction. I do think there's, for every fossil ape species that we see and have evidence of, there must have been many, many more that we don't. But I think there's also going to be an overlap where some species are classified as separate when they may well be the same. And that's due to interpretation and how much evidence you have. And yes, there are very many grey areas of overlapping, even in Homo species. Look at all the arguments about how Neanderthals, Denisovans, and so on. We don't know. I mean, there's indications that there were many more Homo species than even the ones we know about.
Okay, can I ask Mark to go next, and then we've got a couple of new people I've not seen before. If you want to join in, all right. So, Mark, did you have a point? Mark, you had your hand up earlier.
Yes, well, I was intrigued by the Trachylos footprints. Why do they only have 4 toes?
Let me share it again. Let me try and find it. But I mean, I think if you look at, oh, yes, see what you mean, because it was numbered.
Oh,
yes. No, they did have 5. I think they're just, what they're saying here is that in this particular image, only 4 of them are making an impression. But there are many other pictures, and anyone who wants to Google Trachylos can find pictures and see.
Well picked up, Mark. I'm sure that every land-living vertebrate has a pentadactyl limb and has 5 digits. So no problem. Is someone else got a question or a point? Gareth, do you want to say something?
Only that I'm very excited about Ugandopithecus. Why have I never heard of Ugandopithecus? I tend to ignore anything older than late Miocene, but that's very exciting, and I'm going to go and look it up as soon as this Zoom's finished. Thank you.
Good. Well, I'm happy to share. Happy to share the papers I found on it.
Brilliant.
Interesting.
I wanted to make a point about the chromosome point that the last one you made, because that's something that's fascinated me for a long time. And basically what it is our chromosome number 2, and all the chromosomes are numbered according to their size, right? So chromosome number 1 is the longest, chromosome 22 is the smallest. And basically chromosome number 2 in humans is a telomeric fusion of 2 ape chromosomes. You can look at the banding of the actual chromosomes, and you can see our chromosome 2 is 2 ape chromosomes that's kind of come together. So you know, if you look up telomeric fusion, it's quite interesting to see where it happens. And what I'm very interested in the gibbons. There are 4 main branches of gibbons, and they have different chromosome numbers. And from what I've read, it seems that the most plausible, or one of the most plausible mechanisms for that to happen is hybridization. And I've always thought that this is really quite compatible with all the stuff that you've been talking about, because basically you've got to have a situation where a population gets separated from its sister population for 1 million years or so, and then they're thrust back together again, and then they're separated, then they're thrust back. I mean, we're better than on the coast where you've got rising and falling sea levels over geological time periods. That's quite significant, and it seems to me that that is the best explanation for the strange chromosome number change that we've got. So I think it's completely compatible with, you know, your idea of the, you know, Red Sea. I mean, I agree, you know, that coastal idea later on in the story. I actually like the Afar Triangle there, because there was that inundation, and of course there was a twisting in a little tectonic plate which caused that that flooding. So I prefer that, but it's part the same neck of the woods, isn't it? Same part of the world.
Yes, I mean, I considered that area as well, the Afar, and that's of course where Lucy and many of the other hominids are found. And so that, you know, you could equally argue and say, well, maybe from Trachylos they made their way around and ended up in the Afar region, and human ancestry follows the story that we've been given. The only thing is that I found personally, I think that many of the Australopithecine fossils do seem to be closer in many ways to the extant apes rather than to humans, and the genetic information that I showed showing that the human line is absolutely more different from them, and that humans appeared as if from nowhere. I liked that idea that we were missing in the Pliocene. Where were we? And trying to find that particular spot where there's no evidence.
Yeah.
But also I noticed in my research, I came across, I think it was Reich, the geneticist, who their research suggested that Pan and Homo, chimpanzees and humans, may have been separating for up to 4 million years before they finally split for good. And they think that the final split may have happened about 5 million years ago. So if they were separating for 4 million years up to that point, that means from around 9 million years ago to 5 million years ago. That's the whole post-Valesian Southern Europe time. could that maybe be when one group of something like Uranopithecus got stranded on Crete when it was still part of the mainland, then got isolated for a few million years on Crete, then they made their way back onto the mainland where they mingled again with the surviving ape populations, the pan, let's say, group that were there. So their genes got mixed up again. It became the sort of pan-homo fusion. And then 5.3 million years ago, when the Zanclean flood happened, bam, they were cut off completely from each other and went completely separate directions. So that seems to fit as well in that.
I think whatever our individual angles are, I think we're all agreed it's something coastal, something to do with coast and not savannah. A question from Malgorzata was, when's the book coming out? And I think we all want to know that.
Oh, well, I've got to find a publisher first. I've talked about it more than actually done any looking for, the next step. I'm good at the writing and researching part. After that, I kind of hit a wall. But I've basically written what I started off writing, hoping to be one book. I've reached halfway through. I've reached up to this point, the emergence of Homo, the emergence of Erectus, and decided that has got to be one book on its own, because I've just got too much stuff to, if I carry on in the way I'm going and add another 5 chapters, it's going to be an enormous tome. So it might end up becoming 2 books. So this first book concentrates on the early Miocene apes up into the emergence of Homo. And then I was hoping maybe one day, who knows, to write from Homo to modern humans.
Now we're waiting for 2.
Yeah, I'm at the stage where I'm happy to share what I've written if anybody's interested in reading it, even in this draft manuscript form. Hopefully one day it might get published, but don't hold your breaths.
Well, Francesca, you can always self-publish. I mean, with the Amazon Kindle model. I mean, a lot of people have got a sort of objections to Amazon, and I share a lot of those. But it is a way to get published with no problem at all.
Yes, I know. I have actually self-published various anthologies and short stories like that. But yeah, I would like it to go through a mainstream publisher, because I think it would just get more attention that way. I'm no good at marketing myself, so it would then be in-house only.
Yes, well, I've just been wondering, because there's been a lot of new ideas and new evidence that has come up since Elaine Morgan published her book, The Descent of Woman, many years ago. And I'm just wondering about why the academic community is still very hostile to the idea of human beings having undergone an aquatic stage during their evolution. I wonder what is the reason for this hostility?
Very good question.
Ignorance, mainly.
We all want to know the answer to this question.
Well, I think ignorance. They just don't know about it. Like we were saying at the beginning of this discussion, either they don't know anything, they've never read about it, and they've been warned off it. So, anyone talks about aquatic ape, just tell them, go away. So without doing their own research, that's just what they've been told to believe. In some cases, I think it's changing. I've seen a lot of younger people seem to be interested. I've been engaging more on Facebook in evolution groups. And they're more like, yes, I've heard about that. Oh, that's interesting. Yes, why don't we talk about that a bit more? I don't know. I feel that everybody's felt this for a while, I think, but we feel like it's time. It needs to change.
I think Simon's the guy to say something here, because he's at the pointy end of all this. So do you want to say something, Simon, on that?
Well, yes, it's because academic anthropologists, students who take anthropology degrees and specialize in biological anthropology, have never seen it in their textbooks. And the professors didn't talk about it. And if your professor didn't talk about it and it's not in the textbook, you're almost bound to think it's rubbish. And that's the response I get when I ask people directly, what do you think of it? They say, oh, it's rubbish. Well, have you read anything about it? No, of course not. I wouldn't waste my time. I would have been told about it by my professors, and I would have read it in the textbooks. And it's simply missing from the textbooks. Nothing about aquatic or naked or bipedalism is covered, but not anything to do with semi-aquatic existence.
I should say, Edward, that Simon is Professor Emeritus at Oxford Brookes University. So he's been battling this personally for about 20 odd, 30 odd years, haven't you?
Yes, nothing in the textbook. Every year they produce a new edition of the same textbook, and every year it's missing. And I look at them all, and I try and write to them, and they won't answer. Can't get any response, as I said earlier.
Yeah. But have you noticed how they're starting to introduce certain concepts from aquatic ape theory, almost by stealth? You're hearing more and more about how early Homo used aquatic resources and must have spent more time coastally than we had previously assumed, and the wading thing is starting to pick up again now. People are saying, okay, well, we can accept that maybe they waded, but we're certainly not going to go with the full aquatic immersion, and not, you know, even among the 18.
They're nervous about going for the full whack because
yes,
they're worried about their colleagues not giving them good reviews when they want to publish something. That's why we all have trouble publishing anything about amphibious apes.
Yeah,
and,
I mean, I can speak to that. I'm currently trying to get a paper published with Richard Wrangham on the wading hypothesis, and Richard Wrangham is so nervous about even mentioning Elaine Morgan or Alistair Hardy or anything like that. He wants to divorce the two and make out that this is something completely different and something completely new. It's really frustrating. But I mean, I'm thinking, well, at least if I can get a foot in the door with a paper, then I can write another paper citing that, going a bit further. You know, it's just like a sort of a strategic thing.
Yeah. Well, Richard is one of the few people who've come forward and said he agrees it's likely.
Yeah, he did a wonderful part in a documentary called the H2O, the molecule that made us, and in there he's wading in the water with bonobos, saying, and he basically says, this is what we came from, a wading ape. Yeah. So
yeah.
Does anybody else like to say something? I'm just a bit concerned about the time.
Just one other question directed to Francesca. Francesca, when is this appearing on YouTube? This meeting?
Oh, that's up to Algis.
What I normally do, I record. This meeting is being recorded. I'll do a little bit of editing to get rid of some awkward glitches, and then I'll probably post it tomorrow. So it'll be on YouTube tomorrow, usually within 24 hours.
Excellent.
Okay, well, in that case, I think I'm going to close because, you know, it is now nearly 9:30. So thank you again, everyone. And really brilliant talk, Francesca.
Really
That's fantastic. Really excellent. I wish I'd heard this talk before I wrote the draft paper with Richard, because a lot of it was about Miocene apes. And there's a few species there that, you know, like Gareth said, that I didn't know about. So it's certainly going to add that to my literature as well. So thank you very much.
You sent
Pleasure.
a link to that video you mentioned?
Sorry.
I was asking for that video that you mentioned of Wrangham. Could you share the link or send the link somewhere?
I don't think it was a
that
video.
One about this is where we come from. The one.
The H2O.
Oh yes, that video. Well, if you Google H2O, the molecule that made us, you'll probably find a link, but it's probably paywalled. I don't know if you remember, but when I did my talk back in last November, I showed a little clip of that. So if you look at the very first What Talk in the series and sort of go through towards the end, I actually show that clip with Richard Wrangham in there.
Okay, I think I have it already. Yes, thanks. I mean, just found it.
All right, well, thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to stop there because it's getting late. So thank you again, Francesca, and we'll see you next time. The next one, I think, is going to be a bit strange. We've got a virtual. We've got a kind of a virtual talk with John Langdon. So next time, Vernon Reynolds, who's a great guy, he made a comment that we shouldn't be doing just, you know, doing our own thing and repeating what we believe. You know, it kind of becomes a bit cliquey. And he suggested that we get somebody who's kind of opposed. And there are not many people who even speak about this, but John Langdon is one such person. And I don't agree with him at all, but he's going to give a talk on the origin of bipedalism. At least we're showing that we're open-minded. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone, thank you.
Thank you for joining. Bye.
Bye bye.